Steinfeld, who is not here quite yet. He should jump on soon. Me, Shanti. And today we have a very special guest, Bonnie Greenwell, Ph.D. She actually got her Ph.D. with studying Kundalini Energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I will read her bio, and then we'll jump into Bonnie's Kundalini awakening story. Dr. Bonnie Greenwell is a transpersonal psychotherapist and a non-dual teacher in the lineage of Adyashanti, known for her research and work with Kundalini experiencers. She has focused for over 35 years on providing guidance for people who have had challenges with Kundalini awakenings or other kinds of spiritual emergence issues. She is the author of When Spirit Leaps, Navigating the Process of Spiritual Awakening, the Kundalini Guide, which I just read and is wonderful. I highly recommend it. The Awakening Guide, and Energies of Transformation, all based on her doctoral research and consultations with thousands of experiencers. She has identified 7 categories of phenomena that are reported in a Kundalini process and supports experiencers in harmonizing the process and moving forward to the realization of their true nature. Currently, she does assessments on the web, offers webinars for experiencers, and holds non-dual satsangs in Ashland, Oregon. Her Awaken Living blog is at shantyriver.wordpress.com, and her websites are kundalini.kundaliniguide.com and awakeningguide.com. And I have all of those listed in the description below on my channel, so you can look that up there and go to her website. So welcome, Bonnie.
Thank you, Kai.
Very big pleasure to have you here. I feel very honored.
I'm happy to be here
on the show. So would you like to start with telling us a little bit about your own Kundalini awakening experience?
Sure. I would say, and one of the advantages that I have in working with people is that I've gone through a very long journey myself, and along the way have been exposed to a lot of different teachers and a lot of different possibilities for growth and change and transformation. Mm-hmm. So I was raised Catholic. I was pretty devotional as a kid, and so was my mother. And I had a good family. But when I was 14, my whole life changed because my mother died suddenly. She had a brain hemorrhage, and it pretty much destroyed my father as well. He was emotionally overwhelmed by it. And it caused me to lose my faith in God. I just thought, if God would do something like that, it didn't. If it existed at all, it was indifferent. And so I kind of closed down. I was very closed down for a number of years. And then after I was married and had some children, we got involved in an encounter movement that was called Creative Initiative Foundation. This was a long time ago. This was back in the 60s and 70s. Okay. And it was a group that wanted to change the world, and had been started by a couple at Stanford. And the leader was a woman who was really, really powerful. And so we began to go to retreats and programs with this organization. And that's where I was initially exposed to meditation and to psychology, really. I'd been studying journalism before. I wasn't really interested much in psychology. And then a few years later, we left the organization for various reasons. And I went through a tremendous trauma around losing those connections, because during that time, I'd opened up a lot more and I'd become more connected with the women, particularly in that organization. And so I think that really threw me into a very deep search. But the question in that process I was in there that came up for me was, is there a God? And somebody said, if you want to know if there is God, you need to meditate. And so I threw myself into meditation. And especially after we left the group, my kids would go off to school and I'd meditate all day. And at that time, I also went into Jungian analysis. And my analyst was a follower of Yogananda. And I also became good friends with another psychologist who was a follower of Muktananda. I was actually doing some teaching in his lineage. And so I was kind of exposed from both methods, both approaches to meditating. And during that time, Muktananda was in Oakland, and I only had one encounter with him, and it was on a Christmas day with my husband and kids. My friend took us all up there to the ashram. It was just this wild place. It was my first exposure to Indian anything.
Wow.
And it was this pink and purple draperies everywhere, and everybody chanting and walking around in white robes. And it felt very strange to me, and he felt kind of scary.
Yes.
But he bopped us all with a peacock feather, and then eventually we went home, and I never really pursued it. I was really busy with, my kids were in the Little League. I was really into all of that type of thing, and also had been gone back to college to get my bachelor's.
How old were your kids at that point? That they were
I was trying to remember that. I would guess they remember it. I would guess they were about 9, 11, and 12, something like that.
Okay.
And anyway, and then I also was doing practices of Yogananda's, some of the practices of the SRF organization, and meditating a lot. And at that time, I had a really profound opening into, I don't know, I'd answered the question, is there a God, for me? It just opened me up. And I was just happy for the first time in 15 years. And I didn't go away. I just felt really good. And I wasn't in school at the time. I was raising kids, and I was washing dishes one day, and I thought, if I feel like this all the time, I'll never do anything with my life. I was young, and it was the kind of during the time of the beginning of the women's movement. And so I decided I wanted to go back to school and become a counselor. So I somehow, even though my bachelor's was in journalism, got into the counseling program at a University of Santa Clara through a connection with a man there who recognized my engagement in the creative initiative. So I went back to school. And so during that time, I also continued meditating and doing practices. And it seemed like, and then I also went to Egypt with Thomas, with my analyst and his wife and my husband and a few other people. We went there. So I had to go through a stage of individuating, because I got married when I was 19. Wow. And I hadn't, and it was a different world back then in the 50s and 60s. Yes. And I had to do and so I think I would say I spent those next years individuating as being able to claim myself as a person who could do what I wanted to with my life, and wasn't forced to just play the roles. And then after some years, which I can't remember all the details, I decided to go to the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, because I'd gotten so involved with both getting my master's and practicing therapy. I had kind of given up the spiritual work, and I knew that I was missing that. And at that time, the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology had June Singer on the staff. She was a well-known Jungian analyst, which interested me a lot. And they had a lot of spiritual teachers that would come through from different lineages, as well as energy work, body therapists. So I was interested in all three things. So I thought I might as well get a doctorate for it, and instead of doing it all separately. So I went to ITP, kind of scared, still pretty conservative. And
you were with your husband this whole time?
Yeah, I'm still with him. I've been
for
almost 60 years.
Amazing.
Yeah. Wow. So in a way, we're very different, but he has been a stabilizing force in my life, and allowed me to feel pretty free to do what I felt I needed to do. So anyway, at ITP, was at a workshop with Gay Hendricks, who is a wonderful man who was doing energy work at the time. He doesn't, he and his wife do other things right now. They focus more on relationship. But in those days, he was developing a form of breath work that was called radiance breath work. And it was a little bit, and Stan Groff was around too, and the breath work that he did. But I watched Gay working at a class in a program, and it was the first time in my life I realized the body was an aspect of spiritual awakening, that you could bring the body into spirituality. It just hadn't dawned. I was raised Catholic. I never really got that connection.
Right.
And so I went to Gay and I said to do some one-on-one work, and I just said, I want to remove any barriers to knowing God. That's all I'm interested. I'd already done a lot of analysis, and I wasn't kind of looking for psychological work at that time. And whatever happened between us in those energy sessions, the first time I worked with him, I went back to class. In those days, we sat on the floor at ITP, was sitting in a class, and all of a sudden the energy erupted. And it was like it was going up over and over and over again. Just
I read that, and you were in your class, in the classroom?
Sitting in a classroom. But remember, it was ITP, so it's a very tolerable place. And I'd been there a while. I don't remember if that was my second or third year. And so I was just enjoying. It was very blissful. It was like kind of getting higher and higher and higher. And then after class, we had a little tiny meditation room there. So I went and sat in there for an hour or two and just kind of let things happen and just surrendered into it. And so that was the beginning. And it took me into a kind of a transcendent space that lasted for quite a long time, feeling everything was perfect, like no problems in the world, just kind of wandering the streets, feeling good. I had 3 teenagers at home at the time. My husband was a corporate executive type with aerospace. So I had a really busy, ordinary life, but everything was just beautiful. And
can I ask you, was Gay doing breath work with you?
Yeah, it was a form of, I also during that time started working with training to do the work that Stan Groff did, the holotropic breath work too. But yes, Gay was doing breath work at that time, and it was different than Stan's work because it was one-on-one, and he worked on your body, and he would have you just how you breathed and use his hands to open up different areas of the body in an hour session. Pardon me? Gay Hendricks.
Gay Hendricks?
Gay Hendricks.
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry for being late.
Yeah, he's not doing that anymore, but in those days that he was training people in that, and I ended up working with him for quite a while and going to workshops and learning how to do that kind of work, which I did for a few years in those during that period of time. I started adding that to my own therapy practice because I was practicing therapy. Pardon me?
Breath work? Was it the breath work that activated the Kundalini, you think?
Definitely, but I had been meditating for 15 years, so it wasn't a lack of, there was a lot of preparation, and I'd had opening experiences. In fact, I'd had another energetic experience following a really deep psychological work I had done, but I never associated it with Kundalini. But afterwards, I could look back and I could see times when there were, you could say, preliminary activity, but that was when I really knew that was what this was, when I really knew that it existed, even because I hadn't really had a name for it before. And then
go ahead. No, I was just curious, the rest of the journey, if it stayed that intense? Or
no. Well, what happened is that, which I won't go into, but one of my sons went through a major trauma during that time, and dealing with that kind of pulled me back to earth. He was 20 at the time, maybe 19 or 20. And so having to deal with that, it was like that was all I could do at the time. And I started out as completely open, but it just grounded me again, brought me back. But in meditation, always after that, meditation was always different. It was always more opening. And I had graduated. Then I decided to do my doctoral research on the question of why was this such a positive experience for me and so difficult for other people I was talking to. It wasn't hard to find people. I was at ITP. There were other students there who'd experienced it. And I hung out at Esalen a little bit with Stan Groff and did a month-long program there. And there were people there who had experienced it. So it wasn't hard to find subjects for my research. So I identified a dozen people who looked to me like they were having Kundalini experiences. And I did a lot of research, interviews with them to find out how it opened for them, what their history was, what they did to cope with it, what worked for them, what didn't work. And that's where I identified these 7 categories of phenomena that seem to appear more than once. They might at least 3 or 4 people were having those kinds of experiences. Everybody doesn't have all the 7 phenomena, but I identified these 7 categories that
Now, were these people conscious that they were having a Kundalini awakening?
By the time I interviewed them, they were, but some of them were in organizations like Muktananda's, and others were not. It was a spontaneous kind of awakening. So I began to see a lot of different ways and triggers for this kind of an energetic awakening. It might be doing breath work. It might be one woman, she was being mugged at the time. She was but she was somebody who had practiced yoga for a long time.
Wow, that's traumatic.
Another one was smoking dope and staring at pictures of Muktananda. Another, I don't remember all of them right now. It was a long time ago.
Was there anything that all of them had in common? Was there something that you could trace to a common factor?
Well, that's a complicated question. There's different patterns of factors. Now, with all that I've talked to at least 5,000 people over the years since then, one of the most common factors is that somewhere in their life, they always had the question, is there a God, or what's truth? What is true? Mm-hmm. There were some longing, even as a child, to know what was going on. Many of them had yoga in their background, not necessarily understanding Kundalini, sometimes just very good, intense yoga practices. Many of them had meditation in their background. Some of them had a trauma in there. A lot of them had trauma. One of the things that I've learned is that when there's been a lot of trauma in your childhood, either physical or sexual, it's much harder to go through this process, that it brings up all the, what I have come to think of Kundalini as a clearing process as much as a transformative one. And everything that's unconscious or held inside that hasn't been worked through is still there in the energy field. And when Kundalini activates, and sometimes I believe particularly sexual trauma can open it up as a child, but it doesn't come up all the way. But it's that type of person may be more vulnerable to a sudden awakening, say the first retreat they go to, or some simple practice they do, and all of a sudden, wham, they have all this energy and they're terrified because it brings up the traumatic memories, and they may not have an exact memory, but it brings up the body memories and of invasion, or just traumatic emotions, sometimes out of body experiences that they experienced as a child when this was happening. So there's a whole population, a subgroup that's vulnerable to an awakening that's sudden, that hasn't done spiritual practices necessarily. So anyway, there's just a lot of different reasons, but there's different patterns. In my book, I talk about all the different ways I've seen. Deep devotion is a classical thing in the scriptures that can cause an awakening. And so I would say in my journey, I went through a strong devotional period with Yogananda. I wasn't part of their organization, but I just felt really connected to him. Then I went through this strong energetic change when I was at ITP. And after that, I was I don't know, I would say I was very spiritually oriented, but I didn't feel quite finished. I knew that there was something else, I just didn't know what it was. And that's when a few years later, well, first I went through this period of all of a sudden Kundalini, people were interested in Kundalini. The Spiritual Emergence Network was doing this huge conference on it. And I was one of the organizers of that. And I was involved in doing workshops there and meeting people there. And my first book came out at that time. I just made it come out so it would be available at that conference. And that's how I got started in my work, which was a very long time ago. And there wasn't much of anything written other than Lisa Nella's book that was written by Westerners on Kundalini.
What year did your first book come out?
1990.
Okay.
And so
what do you
that
think is
I'm
oh no. Oh, so can you hear me? I was just wondering what you think is happening physiologically when this energy is released in the body. What do you have an idea of what?
Well, I ended up studying quite a bit with some of the Kundalini yogis in India. At first, I went to Baba Haridas in California. He gave me access to all of his writings and allowed me to go through their yoga teacher training to learn the philosophy behind it, because I knew nothing about classical yoga when this happened for me. And I wanted to do the dissertation, and I wanted it to be based on solid understanding of how the Indian model worked, because I didn't want to just, make up something. And so then I also met a friend who took me to India, who had a teacher there who gave me a lot of information. So I pretty well use, when I talk about it, if people want that kind of information, the yogic model, because it's the most comprehensive. So I see us as having I see us as a pile of molecules. We're energetic fields, and the subtle body is the map of that energetic field. And that the yogis believe that at conception, energy enters the egg, and the Kundalini causes this creation of the baby in the womb. And when the body's fully formed, the residual coils at the base of the spine, and it holds your basic pranic field in stasis until you die. And when we die, it unravels and leaves the body. And that the practices of yoga, and as it turns out, also Qigong and breath work will do it too, tend to open up this coiled energy and bring it up through the body. Now, it does this in many different ways. It depends a lot on the practices, your history, I don't know, many other factors, maybe
Don't
previous
you think
lives.
past lives must come into it as well?
Yeah, I think in a number of cases, it seems like somebody is simply retracing something they've learned before. It's happened before. There, people like that are often in traditions, or they have a guru appear to them from a tradition. I have one friend that happened to. But the energy is transformative, and when it opens up before you're dead and moves through your body, and it's a clearing out. And I believe its function is clearing out of consciousness all the beliefs, all the positions, all the hang-ups, everything you're identified with. Because, well, what happened, I need to complete my story just a little bit, because when I met Adyashanti, everything shifted for me again in a whole different way. And I would say that although the Kundalini had been active and I felt it was good for me, it wasn't ever, it brought up a lot of psychological stuff, but I had a lot of tools for working with that, since I was working with people that were really great therapists in order to get my own training. So I'd done a lot of personal work as well as years of analysis. So when I sat with Adya, I had gone to India and I had seen this classic Kundalini model. You move the energy up and it goes up through the chakras, and when it goes through the crown, you experience unitive realization of yourself connected to everything. And I kind of thought that was the way it worked. But when I started sitting in Adya's retreats, I started seeing people have massive awakenings of consciousness before the Kundalini awoke, before there was any energy movement, and where they were aware of energy moving. And then after that realization, the energy started moving up.
Wow.
So then I began to explore that why in Buddhism and in other practices that are not aware of Kundalini or energy related, they have systems that are simply working with this ability to change consciousness, to shift into a different state of being. So sitting with Adya, I also experienced a tremendous shift in my own state of awareness. And
do you feel that's what brought you to completion, or do you feel like you've reached completion with the Kundalini?
I think that it annihilated the seeker, but I don't think there's ever completion. I think, as Adya has said, how can we talk about completion? We're talking about the infinite. And I think that's really true. I don't think there's an end point where the mind says, oh, now I know it all. In fact, if anything, you're humbled. You say it's more like, oh my gosh, what we are is so much bigger than the mind can even hold. So, but what happens at a certain point, when you reach a certain point of the energy kind of grounding in your body in a way, there's just nothing else to search for. You just don't feel like searching. It's like everything is okay. And that longing that has been satisfied, that it drives most spiritual seekers all their lives. It's like, I mean, I'm happy to have more experiences, but I don't care if I don't have any experiences at all. And
that and you, Adyashanti, that piece, did you get that from Adya?
I got that from sitting with Adya. You know, it wasn't like a teaching. It was more like my direct experience of sitting in silence with him for 10 days. And so
but he doesn't Kundalini, does he? Does he acknowledge the, because
Adya, yes. Adya woke up in the Zen tradition, but his awakening involved a radical Kundalini arising in which he thought he was going to die. And wow. He thought he was dying, and he just said, I don't care. I give up. Let it happen. What
was that experience? Can you talk about that at all?
Well, he writes about it, and it's in some of his books. I can't say exactly which ones right now, and he doesn't teach Kundalini. He's not trying to get people to raise Kundalini, but he has a very deep wisdom and ability to meet people where they are. And he started meditating when he was 19. He read the book Be Here Now. He saw the word enlightenment, and it just set him on fire. And he met a teacher who lived in, actually, Adya lived in my neighborhood. He grew up a few blocks from where I live.
Wow.
He's the same age as my kids, my sons.
Where was it?
It was in Cupertino in California, a little town which is now the heart of Silicon Valley. And he was a bicycle racer. That was what he thought he was going to do, was compete with bicycle racing. But he started going to the yoga, to the Buddhist practices that a woman in our area was offering, who was a student of, I should know, it's all my lineage and I don't have it in my head right now. But she was a Zen practitioner who was authorized to teach, who was a beautiful lady. And she was a mother and had kids, but she did Zen practice in her home. And he started sitting with her regularly. And then he started going to a Zen center up in the Sonoma area and sitting also. And he built a little hut in his backyard and started meditating many, many hours a day. And the way he describes it, eventually, after some years, he was probably 25 at the time, he was sitting in his little hut very intensely, and he just gave up. He just said, I can't do this. It's over. I give up. He says he woke up out of failure. He just felt like he'd completely failed. And in that process had this intense rising of energy that just swept through his whole body and out the top of his head. And he thought for sure he was going to die. And he just said, I give up. I don't care if it kills me. I let it go. And when that passed, as I recall, and don't quote me because I'm just remembering vaguely here, he started laughing hysterically. And and that was kind of his first awakening. And he says that for the next few years, he kept hearing a little voice that would say, don't stop, that's not all of it. Mm-hmm. And so he kept sitting and had other experiences that he's described as vast openings of recognition of, I hate to even say his stuff because I'm not saying it.
No, that's fine. That's enough.
He says it beautifully. Anyway, he's a beautifully awakened being. And he was the first. I've sat with over a dozen gurus in my life. I've done a lot of different things. And he's the first teacher. So obviously he's my teacher. We all have our teachers. When being with him, I know that what he is and what I am are exactly the same. Mm-hmm. For me, it broke any barrier of separation of this idea that consciousness, the knowing, there's one consciousness. And this deep peace that comes with that. That's why the seeker collapses. It's like everything's okay. You're okay. You're human. It's okay to be a human. Life is tough at times. It's okay that life has got its challenges. You can go into a transcendent space. I had a vision one time of that. What it's like is we're in this breezeway. Consciousness is in this empty space of this breezeway of spaciousness, no content. And it can fall into transcendent, unbounded consciousness, and it can fall into life. Mm-hmm. And if you prefer one or the other, you're not completely free, because we're living both.
Do you think there's more people having that Kundalini awakening now? It seems like it's, to me, more. Maybe it's the energy of the earth that's activating. What do you think? Is it more, or are we just talking about it more?
I don't know. It's so hard to say because we have the internet today, and I get people all over the world calling me, and it's we don't know whether this was happening 100 years ago, but nobody ever talked to anybody about it. Or the ones that were having the experience were all tied up nicely in little ashrams and zindos, and nobody ever went anywhere. They stayed with their other fellow monks.
I think it is happening. I think it is more of a planetary, energetic upgrade. And I think
I hope.
And don't you think it's also so catchy in a way? There's initiations that, like, you can transmit that to someone else and they will have that awakening. I mean,
yes, I do. But let's see, how can I say this? Well, I think that our culture in the West has been seeded. It was seeded in the 60s and the 50s by the gurus and the lamas and the people that came from the East and started teaching meditation and yoga. And so we're seeing the results of that early seeding now. There's people older like myself that were initiated at that time, and now today there's a lot more of it out there, and even everybody's starting to meditate these days because they think it'll help them with their careers or with becoming calmer. They don't understand, they don't know the spiritual elements of it. And we're even bringing it into schools in many cases, or the mindfulness programs. So it's becoming much more common. Not everybody, though, who meditates or does yoga does have a Kundalini awakening, that's for sure. It seems much more like people will say, well, why me? And I just say, well, I guess your number's up. Some people it's going to happen to. Others can stay with it for years and years, and it doesn't seem like whatever they're seeking doesn't awaken for them. But it is seated more broadly in the culture. So those that are vulnerable to it, we're going to see more of them awakening. I also do see it as I know you talked last week a little bit about it as an evolutionary process. And I believe that's possibly so. I think that it obviously changes the way the brain works. It calms down the mind and the way we look at things. It changes. You let go of the identifications with your own personal story, so to speak, and see yourself as more a part of the collective whole of life. And I think that's good. Pardon me?
Do you feel an energetic upgrade, like on the Earth itself, on the planet? Are you tuned into that at all, or not?
I try not to adapt beliefs. I know there's a lot of theories and a lot of beliefs out there, and they could be true and they might not be true, and I don't want to be tied to a particular belief system.
I guess.
And I talk to other people, though, who seem to feel that. I'm not someone that a lot of stuff doesn't happen so consciously for me. And I think it's because I'm very grounded, and that's why I'm useful to a lot of people as kind of a bridge. But I've had clients who have much more dramatic experiences of connecting with the earth or connecting with entities in other dimensions and psychic stuff and high sensitivity, so they can't handle being around people that have any darkness at all in them. And that's just not true for me. My experience is much more inside of me, inside of my core. It's like this deep peace, even when things are upsetting. And it's like, and this too. It's like, oh, okay, this too, and this too, and this too. It's like trying to hold all of it without resistance. And so I'm kind of in that space personally, but certainly I have heard every story you could possibly imagine, and so many different perspectives that are so heartfelt, that I just think we each have our own unique roles and our own unique. It's like we're all facets of one diamond, and we each have a little different angle, a little different place that we're connected. And that's how it feels.
Byron?
Pardon me?
Have you ever with Byron Katie?
I haven't sat with her, but I'm quite familiar with her work.
Well, she has a lot of energy. I was, sitting next to her, and I felt this and she doesn't talk about it. I said, you have a Shakti, and she said, well, that's nothing to talk about. And I said, well, it's a transmission, though. I felt activated in that presence. Yeah. So, some people, I guess
a lot of people are in lineages that just don't recognize it as important. They might, if it's there, it's there, and you can certainly pick it up. Most of the non-dual, and that's another way that I'm very unusual, because I'm in a non-dual lineage, but I really have a respect for Kundalini and a value of it. But I see, to me, it's become more the nature of waking up to the nature of consciousness is what's more important, or waking up to the fact that we are pure awareness, that learning to come from what's aware rather than being identified with the thoughts and the feelings. So that's a whole different pattern. But since I've gone through the Kundalini process, I really recognize that too. And I've certainly can pick up energy with many people. And I've sometimes asked teachers who don't talk about Kundalini whether they've had the experience, and they all admit they have, but they just don't see it as, they're not going to talk about it. They don't want to, they're afraid it's going to get people too excited or distracted or compare, you know, how much is, I have more than you, that kind of thing.
No, I think Kundalini itself is trying to show us, this is just my belief, and I know it's not belief, about showing us how important embodiment is. There's awareness, which is sort of a mental thing, but there's embodiment that we're here to ground awareness in. Now, I don't know why it feels important to me that that's part of the incarnational experience.
I agree completely, because the systems where people are only waking up from the crown, they're often, those people become very detached and distant, and they establish beliefs that are separating. And you really have to bring it back down below the neck. And that's one of the major things I teach people. Bring awareness down below the neck, open up the heart, focus on the heart, and bring it into your body too. And I know how it feels to have Kundalini move you. When, after my awakening, is when I started to work with founding this Kundalini research network. And I organized whole conferences, large conferences before the internet, effortlessly. It was just carrying me. And I could speak before large groups of people effortlessly. And I could never do that before. And it was like, it just moved me to create that organization at that time, and run these conferences. And then I had a group of other people that all came together to do that. And then that part of my life completed at some point about 7-8 years later. And that's when I met Adyashanti. And then I went through into another whole dimension of experience and teaching. So I believe it does. I believe with you that I think of it just as the life force. I love it as a goddess. I can worship her that way, but I deal with it more as the life force is carrying me and everybody. And, you know, the more you can align with what you feel deeply down inside of you, instead of your mind, and just tune into that and kind of lean into it, the more smoothly your life will work. And it's like you have to get, most of the people I talk to are really afraid, and they're contracting, and they're trying not to have their experience, or they're trying to hang on to their former identifications and not understanding why it's not working. And they have to drop down into their deep, authentic self and listen. And sometimes you have to wait a while. You're not going to get, not everybody gets this perfect voice telling them what to do. You often have to just really tune into yourself. And most of us haven't been raised to do that. We've not been raised to listen to ourselves. We've been raised to follow the crowd, to do what our parents think are right, or teachers have told us to follow from the mind, to be successful. That falls away. Your drive will fall away in a Kundalini process, and you're left with nothing. You have to learn to get in complete alignment with your authentic, in tune direction. And that is funny, because it's like karma yoga. It doesn't care about the results. It just pulls you, and you can't be attached to how it's going to work out. You have to just do this and see what happens. And I feel like most of us, all our lives, are having impactful influences on other people, but we don't know it. And you think, oh, I really failed with that. And 10 years later, it clicks into somebody else's mind. And when I had my awakening with Adya, I spent the whole night sitting in the car crying. It was just so overwhelming. But mostly I was feeling such gratitude for every person who had ever touched me along the way with all these different steps I had gone through. It was like seeing each of them as this great gift. And most of them were people I'd never seen again. I knew them for a couple of months or a year, and that was it. So I've really learned to see us all as in this tremendous interweaving of connectedness, and we can't be attached to that I'm going to make somebody get this or do that or wake up. We just give what seems intuitively right in the moment, and whatever is right for them will happen. And it may not have anything to do with us, or it may kick in 20 years later, but there's no point in being attached. And it changes. You can be intuitively pulled one way for a long time, and then it just stops. And that it's like that karma field is finished, and now something new is going to happen. And I think you're probably that way too, Kai. You know, you said you were really embraced in the Muktananda movement, and all of a sudden you realized, well, maybe this is broader than that. Maybe I need to listen to what other people have to say about it.
It
So
was mostly this show, wanting to do this show that made me kind of broaden.
So what made you want to do the show? Where did that come from, you know?
Yes. I mean, that was an inner drive. We had been talking about it for a couple of years, but then I called Alan one day and said, okay, it's time. There's just something inside of me that said, now do it. Yes.
So that's being aligned. For me, that's authentic alignment. When we have that inner, right after my awakening, I started thinking I wanted to, Adya at the time hadn't put out any books. And I knew from my journal, my dissertation book, that it was a way to connect with people. And there were all these files of his talks that people had transcribed. And so I went to him, I said, and I had this conflict in me, because that was what I really wanted to do. I wanted to help him get a book out. But I kept thinking, oh, I can't do that. It's just ego. It's just, you know, I shouldn't bother him with this. And it's probably not the right motivation, but it just kept gnawing at me, you know. So I finally went to him and said, would it be okay if I went through the files and put together a book of your talks? And I said, that's a really good way to get to reach people. And I think you're an end of the road teacher, and a lot of people need to know who you are. And he said, sure. So we worked together, and we put together the book that ended up being Emptiness Dancing. And so it's like that. Something pushes you, and your mind can say, oh, no, you shouldn't do that. You can't do that. It's not okay. But it'll keep nagging at you, and you're not going to be comfortable until you surrender.
Right.
And so that was a very helpful thing for me to.
I really love that you have both the Kundalini and the non-dual perspective, because I've been drawn to both. And the fact that they're separate seems dual to me. So doesn't it seem natural that the two would be together as one? I don't understand the separation.
Well, I think they are in fact the same thing, in that there's one primal force of awareness, or there's not a word for it in English, but let's call it consciousness. That's the simplest way to think of it. And it's the source. There's one source, and the energy of life moves out of that source. And so they're both the same. Obviously, the energy is not other than the source, but the source appears to be quiet, quiescent, but out of it arises everything. So that's kind of the think of non-dual as wholeness or oneness or unitiveness of everything. And so that consciousness is in us. The consciousness in you and I is no different. The consciousness, but the content is in our different bodies and minds is different, but the consciousness behind that is one. There's only one consciousness in everything that has enlivened everything. And it creates somehow energy that gives us these appearances of being separate bodies and having these unique experiences that we each have. But it's all one. So I don't see a real difference, but I do believe that the mind only thinks in terms of opposites. So it's really hard for a non-dualist that hasn't had a Kundalini experience to acknowledge that. And it's hard for somebody who's awakened through a Kundalini experience to think that non-dual, a person could have a real awakening and not have a Kundalini experience. So that's the mind that puts them in separate camps. But anybody that's fully awake is going to go beyond that. They're not going to. But they may not be in a tradition that acknowledges Kundalini. They may not see it as it's a category of irrelevance.
Don't you think, though? I mean, for me, when I feel people have had a Kundalini separate from this awakened thing, that I call it divinity manifesting. Of course, we're all divine, but there is a I don't want to call it special, but it is an activation of a greater awareness of the divine force. And that this is how just I clarify it. And it doesn't mean you're necessarily awake, because a lot of people have Kundalini awakenings and go unconscious as well. But there is this, maybe it's grace or this presence that they embody more than mentally, come to a clarity. I mean, yes, many people have both. I'm sure Eckhart Tolle had this Kundalini awakening and he woke up, and, lots of the Eastern gurus, but I think it's being touched by divinity in a different way. That's just what I've noticed. What do you think about that, Bonnie?
Well,
oops.
I don't quite know what to say about that. I'd say that that's a common perspective, especially among people that are devotional, that it certainly feels that way. It feels like grace, like this incredible grace. I've had people say, oh, it's just love. It's all love. There's nothing else but love. I think it may have to do more with the personality type that experiences that way, that are more of a feeling type person, and they fall in love. Certainly the Christian saints, they obviously, some of them had Kundalini experiences. But they were interpreted as being ill because of it. And yet they were, like Saint Teresa was just passionately in love with the divine. Well, she was probably totally infused, and they talk about being made love to by God. So I think it's a model. It's a way of looking at an experience that's very hard to interpret. And so you might interpret it as the divine has captured me, and I'm so loved. God loves me, and I feel this infusion. Or you might interpret it as, but then there's other people that interpret it that the mind gets a hold of it, and it's interpreted more like power. And there's whole systems that talk about it as a healing methodology. It's you're going to heal. And I believe probably in ancient times, the indigenous cultures, when they had the shamanic cultures, and they did the drumming, and they were raising energy in their community. And I think that was for psychic direction. It was like a communal way of knowing what the tribe should do next, what we should do, how do we solve this or that. And it was more of a collective thing. They didn't go around doing it outside of that, but it was together, with the intensity. And so I think there's different interpretations of the same experience, depending on your culture, your language.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah. It seems like near-death experiences are the same.
Yes.
Because everyone's describing almost the same experience, but from their cultural background.
Very often, yes. Yes.
You talk about your guidebook a little bit, because a friend of mine had an awakening Kundalini, and she said she just had to keep physically working out in order to ground it. But she then discovered your book, and your book really helped her, stay more focused. So could you talk about what you lay out in your guidebook?
Well, I would say, I'm going to give you kind of an overview of like all my books, because I can never remember what's in what book. But basically, I like to talk to people about the fact that not to be afraid of this as energy, because we're energy beings. We're just vibrational molecular structures. So you have to expect, if you're going to go through a transformational change, your energy is going to get reorganized in some way. So I talk about energy, but I also lately talk a lot more about the nature of consciousness. And usually people shift in consciousness, and there's a lot of evidence that the brain is actually getting rebalanced and reorganized. But the things that I feel like what people need is very different from one person to another, that it depends tremendously on their history, their health, their age, whether or not they're stable in the world. Like, it's a lot harder for somebody that's 19 and doesn't have a job yet than somebody that's 60 years old and runs a company and knows how to solve problems and is open-minded. And maybe the 19-year-old is just frightened, and then it's like, I've lost all my drive, I'm dropping out of school, what do I do with my life? So a lot of times it's not just managing the energy itself. A lot of times people need to do something different with their energy. Like, if the energy is too much in the head and they've got headaches and they've got problems, they need to bring it. The most useful thing is usually bring awareness into the heart and do practices that open the heart. If it's too much sexual energy, it's all in the lower chakras and they're going crazy from it, they need to bring it up into the heart. I have put a practice on my Kundalini Guide website called Harmonizing Energy that I hope is helpful for some people to learn to move the energy through the optimal channel and relax into it. The main thing, much of it, you may need to stop for a while. It's like, so my books are designed, I hope, to show people that if this, then maybe that. If this, then maybe that. If you have trauma in your history and you've never done therapy and your energy's driving you crazy night after night, you maybe need to go see a therapist and you need to work through the trauma. And that therapist doesn't have to understand Kundalini. They have to know how to help you heal the inner child that's been wounded by that trauma. Because, I'll quote Adya again, one of the things he said that I love is that when we wake up, a lot of things fall away. But then afterwards, there's a lot of things, a lot of parts of us come up to the surface because they want to wake up too. And so you have to deal with the stuff that comes up piece by piece. And it's obviously going to be different for one person than it is for another, depending on what's in your history. If people are having psychic invasions of some sort, they don't like it, I usually ask them I try to get them to see somebody that's more expertise in that, because that's not my area of expertise. But I do tell them it's possible to stand up to it. The Tibetans say that if you have a dark entity showing up, you probably created it in a previous life, and you can stand up to it and tell it to go away. So for some people, I might suggest that. For others, I might suggest just getting out of bed, turning on the light, and going out and having something to eat, and just, shifting the energy. So people, mostly, they need to not feel afraid. They need to see it as a positive potential, because some of the people don't see that. And some are even told by their teachers, this is dangerous. You're doing something wrong, or it wouldn't be doing this. And some are even sent out of their meditation centers, told to go home because they're disturbing other people. So, you with Muktananda wouldn't have had that issue in that lineage, but most other lineages you do. People who have these things spontaneously might go to a teacher, and the teacher will say, well, it can't be Kundalini because, you weren't in a lineage doing the right things. One student of mine was told by a teacher, it can't be Kundalini because Kundalini is always positive. Oh. Well, wow. So this guy was having all kinds of issues. He had been doing intense, the flying practices in the TM lineage, and it just had thrown his whole energy field out of balance. Other people have medical issues. It can really wreak havoc with your adrenal system. You can have rushes of heat one minute and cold the next. You can have emotional, suddenly you're crying and you don't even know why. So each individual has to be met where they are, and first of all, tuned into, okay, your beingness is wanting you to wake up and transform and change what needs to be done to get in right alignment with that. And you have to teach, I try to teach people to listen to their gut, listen, to tune in and really listen inside, because most of us have an argument between what our mind is telling us and what our heart or our deeper intuition is telling us. And that might be fine for ordinary lives, but once this Kundalini opens, you're going to feel really rotten if you're just following the mental patterns that have evolved from your training in the world. You have to listen to what. I'm sorry.
Do you counsel people? Do you talk to people on the phone? Do you give sessions or counseling? Oh, so they
what I do, people can go to my websites, my KundaliniGuide.com or the Awakening Guide, because I see a different set of issues when somebody's had a real awakening. There's still some cleanup to do usually, but with the Kundalini, it's a whole different set of issues. So I've kind of separated those two topics in my books and in my websites, and they can contact me through my website. And then what I do is send people a questionnaire. I have them fill out a rather detailed history. I want to know about a little bit about their personal history and their practices, and if they're in a lineage, and their age, if they've had a career, if they're working or they're unable to work, those kind of things. And then I do an assessment with them on Zoom, and just give them general guidance intuitively, and also based on what I can see from the questionnaires that might be causing the particular problem that they've identified. So, and
do you ever tell, I mean, to judge people, but do you ever tell people, no, this is not Kundalini, this is emotional problems that you really have to deal with? Or, I mean, have you seen that?
Yes and no. It's pretty uncommon. Most of the people who find me, I really do believe they're in a process, but it may not be very developed yet. It may be really stuck in one area of their body. But I always ask on the questionnaire, describe your initial experience of Kundalini, so that I can pretty well tell intuitively, and also I'm a psychologist. So if they have a lot of emotional issues, I'm very likely to say that you need to have the psychological stuff taken care of in order to have a really to really go through the spiritual process completely. You can't. A lot of people have this belief they're going to jump over all of their issues if they wake up. It's going to magically fix everything. And I talk to them about the fact that transformation isn't magical. It's like if you're going to build a house, you might have to tear down the old house first. If you're remodeling, you're going to take everything out of the house. You're going to, you're going to take it down to the studs, and then you might be able to build something new. And that the system is like that. It's like all of our old patterns and beliefs are being challenged. And it's not anything you're doing wrong. It's the way the process works. Many people will have a wonderful initial experience, and a few hours later or a few days later, all hell breaks loose.
I was going to say that.
And they'll say, well, what the heck did I do wrong? What's the matter with me that this happened? It was so perfect. I want to know how to stay there. And it's like, it just doesn't work that way. There's now, you got the glimpse, you got a glimpse of what you are, what's possible. Now is all the cleanup work that has to be done if you want to embody that. And so in my books, I really try to give people as broad an understanding of all the ways awakening can happen, of different, the 7 categories of phenomena, which are basically physical issues, kriyas, energetic issues, other yoga phenomena like seeing symbols or formulas or doing mudras that happen spontaneously. That's the 3rd category. Psychological and emotional upheavals, psychic openings, and paranormal activities, like sometimes a few people will have experiences like they walk under light signals, light things on the street, and they go out, or they can't work their computer, it goes crazy, or they I don't know, just a few other weird. Oh, and there's also sometimes a vision. People get real scared if they have a vision or they hear a voice because they think it means they're going insane, because that's the only orientation we have in the West. If you hear a voice, even if it's positive, it must be insanity. But many people will have that. I've had that occasionally. It's usually very supportive if you're in a spiritual process. It's not telling you to do anything wrong. It's saying you're going to be okay, or just relax, or you know, we're on your side, some weird thing like that. And then the seventh category for me is samadhi experiences. If somebody's had samadhi experiences, I assume it's Kundalini. If they have energy in samadhi, I don't worry about any of the other phenomena, because if you've had a time in samadhi and awakening and you think you're in a Kundalini process, it's undoubtedly that you are. So those are the categories. So I have those in my books, the descriptions of all of those different categories, and that everybody doesn't have to go through all of them, fortunately. And I talk about how to handle the energy. I talk a lot about grounding, that lay down on the earth, take a break. Don't, if you're too wired, you know, how do you organize yourself? I talk about doing something creative. Creativity is a great way to express some of this with music or art or dance or movement. Let yourself express. So
actually, I feel the Kundalini sometimes when I am being creative. I feel rush up my body and like working through me as an activity.
Absolutely, yeah. I feel like it's when it's creativity is happening, it's the throat chakra that's active. It's like I've been in retreats where I'm very quiet, and then all of a sudden I'm writing a book or something, and I tune in. I say, well, where's my energy right now? It's usually in my throat, and if I move it, then I can stop thinking about writing a book or whatever's going on. I can move it to another area.
Maybe we should do a conference, Kai, like a Zoom conference on Kundalini. Would that be fun, you think? I mean,
well, you might want to check out the Shift Network, because they did a recent one where they had about 10 or 15 different people lecturing on Kundalini. Yeah. So you just check it out, the Shift Network. I was one of the speakers at that conference. That's why I'm familiar with it.
Oh, great.
Okay.
And there's been several others too. Some guy that was in the forest outside of Aurobindo's ashram did a Kundalini, they don't call it a conference, symposium or something. I don't know what it was. He interviewed a bunch of people. I don't know what happened to that, but I expect it's somewhere on YouTube. And then there's another one that I did once too, but I can't remember with whom.
I had a very deep, by Aurobindo's Samadhi spot. I went very deep. Brought me somewhere. Pretty phenomenal. What were you saying, Kai? What were you going to say?
I have a question. Do there tend to be more women or men in your experience?
You know, I keep these questionnaires. I probably have about 3,000 of them. And I tried to go through and count them once, but then I just took a subsection because it was too much to do. But I came up with about 3/5. I think about 3/5 of the people that call me are women, and about 2/5 are men. But it may be a little different. That's from a sample of about 300, I think.
So that's not overwhelming more.
Yeah. No, it's not.
Any particular age? Does it happen to people? Like, I haven't found people under 21 in my experience, but is there an age where somehow I mean, have you found an age common?
Well, I've talked to people. Yeah, I would say you probably have to be sexually mature before you'll have a full-on Kundalini experience. Some people seem to come in the world with it open, but they're not having the wild experiences, but they might be having psychic or spiritual experiences. And then when they're a little more mature, they start having more intense energy. But I'd say I've talked to people mostly between the ages of 19 and 80. And probably there's the most would be between 40 and 55. But I had a 70-year-old nun call me once.
Wow.
She was afraid in her meditation that all the energy was evil because she didn't expect to have any sexual energy after, being celibate all those years.
Did she have an experience of Jesus with that? I'm curious.
Oh gosh, I don't remember much about her experience. It was very early on, but I had an experience with a young man who was he was a freshman in college, and he'd had a terrible automobile accident, and he was studying economics, and he called me, and he became a paraplegic from this accident. He'd had terrible injuries, and he said that he was seeing Eastern deities all over his hospital room, and he didn't know who they were. He didn't have any background at all in who these gods and goddesses were. So I think, and Carl Jung did a lot of research in that area and believes that a lot of these images are coming from the collective unconscious and not necessarily related to your particular path in this life, that you can access anybody's cultural images in these transcendent states. I have one friend who was doing ayahuasca when she was probably 65 at the time. And she said she had an experience where all the different gods appeared one at a time before her. So she had Indians and Buddhas and Christian entities, and I don't know who else, a whole parade of them. So I don't know. Those are interesting experiences. We can't draw a solid conclusion from any experience other than it happens.
Right.
And that's kind of been the way I try to hold these, that, wow, great. But, what might mean something uniquely to you, but there's no collective evidence of exactly what it means. It's just part of we have access to when our consciousness opens up. One of the things I often end up saying to people is that these experiences show us that consciousness is much more flexible and fluid than we ever imagined. And that, a lot of people have out-of-body experiences, which is kind of an initial knowing that consciousness is not really locked in here. And so a lot of these really interesting experiences are just expressions of, oh, consciousness can do that too. Isn't that interesting? There aren't so many boundaries as we think.
Does it ever just stop? Maybe like people have that and it's great, and then boom, it's over, and maybe they're changed or maybe they're not. But have you found that?
Yeah, most of the time. No experience is permanent, and there's no sense in getting attached to it. What you want to find out, if you really want to wake up, is what never changes. No matter whether it's an ecstatic experience or an ordinary experience of looking at the trees, what hasn't changed? And it hasn't changed from the moment you came into the world till today. That's the clue to waking up and being at peace, is knowing what you are. And then you're no longer attached to the dramatic experiences. They're lovely if they show up, but they're not going to show up very often. And people really get themselves in trouble because they want to repeat the wonderful experience over and over again. And they think somehow enlightenment is being in that experience constantly, but that's just not the truth. It's a gift, those experiences. They're teaching sometimes, but they're telling us that we're not who we think we are. And they're playing. Maybe you could call it the universe playing with you. But you want to find out what you are. What was there aware at every moment, and you can't even get rid of it right now if you try. And when that happens, it just becomes much more easy to deal with the comings and goings of this dimension as well as those other dimensions.
So the purpose of a Kundalini awakening is to bring you to that state. Yes.
That's my perspective. Yeah.
I remember in the early days with me, it was all about the phenomena, you know,
Sure. Me too.
having wild kriyas and
Mm-hmm.
manifestations and everything. But now it's the peace.
Yeah.
It's coming into the peace. So I think
Yeah.
it's good for people to know that in the initial stages that it won't stay like that forever. And it's not really the goal.
Yeah, and I think it's okay to enjoy those experiences, and you will until you don't maybe don't care anymore. But there's nothing wrong with enjoying them. So some people think they're supposed to repress them or something. It's not okay. But don't grasp and don't grasp at it, and don't see it as it makes you any better than anyone else. Or I mean, it's not something for the mind and the ego to hold on to. It was a startling gift from the universe that doesn't really even belong to you personally. It's just you got to be the witness of that one. Just like you're the witness of the life that you're in, which is unique from my life and Alan's life. And we each have these unique spots in the tapestry of the world. And we each get unique experiences. And don't think that everybody should have the same experiences. That's another big fallacy. You feel like, oh, they had better experiences than me. Maybe I'm not awake, or maybe I'm not good enough, or I'm not doing the right thing. And it's amazing. I mean, when you've listened to as many stories as I've had, you can't even imagine the variety of ways that life presents itself. But we shouldn't be surprised if we look at ordinary life, look at all the different ways that people think and the kind of experiences. Somebody's got a really horrific problem, their house burns down, and someone else lives in a mansion, and someone else is very happily in a ashram in India. We all have very different life experiences. So it doesn't surprise me anymore that we have different awakening ways of awakening. The end results are the same, but the process varies greatly.
Right. I do you feel like there's still more? I mean, you've arrived at a place, but do you feel like there's more that you want to discover? I mean, I know there's the part that is at peace, but there's the other part that maybe is interested in more. I don't know. I'm just curious about your process.
Well, I'd say for me, I'm willing to be with whatever the universe wants me to see. I don't feel like I'm searching anymore. I feel, I don't know, I enjoy ordinary life, and I know that the work I do is what I have to be doing. It's like I can't not do it for some reason. So I feel aligned with as much as I can do, and I'm interested. Things have changed. When I started doing this work was about 38 years ago. It was a different set of people working and a different world, really. And I was really part of that. I was the director of the counseling center at ITP for a few years, and I had a lot of connections. And now I'm a lot older. I'm semi-retired, and I'm not in the heart of things. And so I'm curious I love meeting new people, young people that are like the Science of Non-Duality organization. I've spoken at their gatherings a few times, and it's wonderful to see young people waking up and coming up with new ways of thinking and seeing and being. So kind of, I'm at that generative stage of life where I want that. I want to know they're going to be there when I'm gone, because I'm not going to be around much longer. And so I don't know. I just feel content. I've had a very fortunate life. I feel like I've had an incredibly fortunate life, and and that this niche that I'm filling right now feels like what I'm supposed to be doing. One of the things I've started doing after I do assessments with people, I do sometimes webinars so people can meet each other, because most of the people who call me don't know a single other person that's ever been in this process. And they love to meet each other. They come from all over the world. I think Zoom is the greatest miracle. Because of that, I can do that. And now I've started doing training programs for those in those groups who are either therapists. I have a couple psychiatrists, yoga teachers, meditation teachers, so that the way that I work can be passed on, at least it'll be changed through their lens, but at least I can pass on what I've learned. So that's satisfying too.
That would be a good thing to broadcast. I don't know if people would want to, but the people meeting each other who are very isolated and then realizing they're part of something much bigger, it would be great to broadcast something like that, I'm thinking.
Well, I think some things like your program will do that, and there's other groups doing it. Certainly, Buddha at the Gas Pump is a wonderful model of interviewing all kinds of spiritually awakened people, and there's a lot more of that type of thing coming on these days. One of the things that's happening that kind of concerns me is that many people are offering programs now on the internet that have very advanced practices, and people are waking up doing them, but they have no support. They have no follow-up, and they don't know quite what's happening. A lot of times the practices are offered by people who even do not have a particularly spiritual orientation. And so they open up the energy, and then all the psychological stuff comes up because there's no screening. So, anybody can do anything. And so I get a lot of calls from people like that. They were doing some practices on YouTube, and all of a sudden their energy's gone crazy, and their doctor doesn't know what it is. Their therapist doesn't.
What kind of practices were they doing? Are they doing like Kundalini yoga, or what were they doing?
Sometimes it's Kundalini yoga. It's breathing practices, intense meditation practices, eye gazing. Mostly it's breathing practices, some kind of breathing practices. So they may not call it Kundalini yoga, but a lot of people know how to use the breath to create altered states of consciousness. Sometimes it's people who have a strong transmission, who are very awake. Their Kundalini is very active, but they've come up with an approach that's not as inclusive as it could be, or maybe they in themselves have that, but they are not able to give people the one-on-one support they need. And so when they don't believe particularly in the psychological work. And so when people get in trouble, they just kind of fall by the wayside. And I think that's going to be happening more and more. I mean, it's a fairly new phenomena because of the proliferation of that anybody can do a YouTube program and or a webinar or training. So
I've had that question over the last few years, because I've seen teachers, not even just on YouTube, but that have very large gatherings of workshops. People are having awakenings and they can't possibly deal with everyone one-on-one.
Yeah.
And is it just a sign of the times that people will just have to navigate through it? Is it irresponsible? I've had that question.
I don't know. It's kind of a fine line. Do you say that if your energy awoke, it was meant to happen and this is just how it did for you?
Right.
Or do you say it was a mistake? I don't think you can make a judgment about that. I think all you can say is, okay, it's happened. So what do you need to do to understand it? First, you've got understanding is the first thing, and then grounding, acceptance. I don't know whether it's a mistake or not. I don't know that there are any mistakes.
Right.
there's just surprises and inconvenient truths, like Algar says. It's an inconvenient truth that now you're in this process of transformation, like it or not.
Yeah.
What are your options?
Right. And is it predetermined? Maybe you already determined that that would happen at that time in that way.
That's right. Maybe you did it in a previous life and you just activated it suddenly without having the same training you did in the previous life.
I have a question from somebody online. This woman, Samantha, asks, which classes should I take if I plan on pursuing transpersonal psychology as a career? I'm a psych major who went back to school at 40 in Louisiana.
Oh, that's great. But ITP doesn't exist in its same form anymore. It's now called Sophia University. I would look around for schools that have transpersonal programs. JF Kennedy, I think if it's still functioning down in the Bay Area and Oakland area, has transpersonal programs. Naropa Institute is transpersonal. That's in Boulder, Colorado. And there's a new transpersonal program in Connecticut that somebody told me about. They had just applied. You can find anything on Google. Just look for transpersonal graduate programs. And if you already have a degree in psychology, it's wonderful because that's what I did. I had my master's in marriage and family counseling in a traditional school. So I was already licensed as a therapist when I went to do my doctoral work. So I could work immediately with clients doing the techniques and the schools. San Francisco has the, I don't know what it's called now. It's been called the California Institute of Integral Studies. CIIS. They have wonderful somatics programs. A lot of people in the transpersonal field are going into somatics. And a lot of times, if you're already a therapist, you can just do a lot of workshops and trainings and pick up many transpersonal skills. So,
Right.
Yeah, that's great. I really encourage that. And there's so many things today, people working with the body and people teaching mindfulness as part of their spiritual practice. So you can kind of create your own transpersonal program. I'll also give a plug to the works of John Prendergast. John is a psychologist, a transpersonal therapist, and a spiritual teacher. And he's written a couple of books that have essays by different therapists. Every chapter is by a different therapist that's transpersonal or that's had some awakening. They're almost all people that have worked with Adyashanti. He's in one of the books. The first book he wrote of this collection is called The Sacred Mirror. So if you're interested in how to do transpersonal therapy, that's a good place to start.
Oh, that's great. One good, interesting thing you said, I don't know, a little while ago is that in the West, we're really not taught to trust these voices, these other levels of reality. And psychology in the mainstream sense has done us a disservice. They've disconnected us from this greater awareness. And it's been great psychology on one level, but now we have to go beyond it. I guess that's what transpersonal is, in a way, to trust the greater workings of the mind that include everything we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Would you say that?
Yeah, I felt that way too. I feel like it's a holistic way that includes the spiritual. It also includes energy work very often and working with the body, not just the psychological stuff. And there's many, pioneers in this field. Arnie Mandel has done amazing work with movement and body. Yeah.
He's great.
Yeah. Great. And of course, Carl Jung you could call him transpersonal. He really incorporated the spiritual, not so much the body, but certainly the creative. And so there's you could say a large subculture in the transpersonal or beyond the personal field. Scienceandnonduality.org is a great place to begin to connect. It's a group of scientists and non-dual teachers who are looking for bridges related to the nature of consciousness. And a lot of people who go to their gatherings are therapists or people looking to merge these two fields together in a way that has an impact on society. They're just intrigued with the nature of consciousness and how do we wake up. So I think there's a lot of new movements that have birthed in the last 5 or 6 years that are leading in that direction. And I'm really hopeful about that. It feels like there was this movement back at the beginning that I was real involved in, and then it kind of became dormant for a long time. And now there's just a new movement happening of people bringing holistic thinking that includes the whole beingness and mindfulness. I mean, that people have done so much lately, last few years, with mindfulness, even in the schools. And so I think it's coming together, but we may always be a subculture. I mean, I always say, if you want to get it in perspective, look to how many people watch football games.
Yes.
Seems like much bigger crowds in those stadiums than you see at meditation retreats. So just recognize that. Don't get too blown up about it. Just take care of yourself and what the territory that you have influence over.
Don't you think this time, these last 6 months, this crisis, this quarantine has shifted, at least for people I know and for myself, shifted an awareness of something more than football games and shopping and eating out? I mean, it's brought a lot of people back in. I mean, what's your perspective on what we've been going through?
Well, I think you're right in that regard. There's a lot of people that are finding the value in not being out on the freeway all the time and having a quieter lifestyle. But I also think there's a very high level of anxiety and conflict in our culture right now. And that people tend, when they're functioning from fear, to grab onto rigid beliefs and positions and these terrible conspiracy theories and things like that, because when we function out of fear, we're just not very functional. We're grasping for something to hold on to. And so I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us to help people release anxiety and learn to deal with the kind of trauma, really, that COVID and the political situation has caused. And but I just put it into historical perspective. Show me a time in history that spent 50 years with people being happy with each other. If you look back, I mean, there's always a war. There's probably been 4 or 5 just in my lifetime, and there's always terrible things going on somewhere in the world. The human, I feel, and I rationalize it by saying we're very immature as a species. We're maybe around 14. We haven't really matured into our potential. There's just, and that's why we cause each other so much pain. And as individuals, all we can do is try to not cause pain, try to find the freedom in ourselves to be with what is as it is, and but not carry it with pain and resistance and anger, but more with. One of the things I've learned in my own process is that when you go through the rage, it's something you don't really hate about life that's out there. You go all the way through it, you sit and you let yourself burn it through. What you find at the core is love. You would not be mad at what's happening if you didn't love what was potential. You wouldn't be mad at cruelty if you didn't love humans and want them not to experience cruelty. You wouldn't be mad at bad choices that are made politically if you didn't love the possibility of people caring for one another. And so it's much easier to carry around the love and to be an activist through love than it is through anger and rage. And I think that's one of the things as a culture we have to learn. And I'm hopeful that as more and more people wake up, the potential for doing that will become more possible, at least in a subculture, just least, coming up from the bottom. And I really believe that it doesn't take a lot of people to bring about a change, but it takes a sincerity and an openness of spirit and a willingness to really see what's true, what's there, without defending ourselves so much. So we're living in interesting times, but then I think sometimes of my parents, and they had to live through World War II, you know, as young people, as young parents. That couldn't have been easy,
No.
you know, but then those of us that weren't there are not old enough to remember it, don't have the scars from that one. But this is ours. This is our time.
Wow. Thank you.
Thank
So
you, Bonnie.
how do people find you, Bonnie? What's your website again?
The best way is to go to either kundaliniguide.com or awakeningguide.com, and there's a contact page there, and there's also a description of what I do and what's available, and there's a lot of essays on the topics. So that's the best way to contact me. I always get those emails forwarded from my websites. I have a Facebook site called Shanti River Center that I post on sometimes, but I'm terrible at answering messages. I just don't have time to be active on Facebook. And I also have a blog that I post on occasionally that is called, it's at Shanti River at WordPress.com. And I think I've recently posted an essay talking about these times. So, you know, every once in a while I get inspired and put something up there, but I don't write on it real consistently. I've also had Kundalini Guide blogs, which you might stumble into, but I tend not to get around to those very often either. You know, and I'm getting old, so I kind of titrate my time. I don't spend a lot of time working if I can avoid it. I try to control myself in that regard so that I don't get burned out.
Thank you so much for taking time for us
today.
Oh,
this is great. I love these opportunities because it's important for me to get my perspective out there right now.
So. Absolutely.
Yes, maybe we'll have you back sometime in a round table discussion, maybe not a whole conference, but just.
Yeah, sure. Anytime.
With other guys to talk to, Tom with the non-dual approach to Kundalini too. And
yeah,
it might be good. So thanks. Yeah. Thank you again for your time here, Bonnie.
You're very welcome. It's great to meet you.
Great
it's always good to see more people, as I said, carrying the word, the message of what's possible, you know?
I think it's important to talk about because, like you said, some people don't know what's going on with them. And the more this is talked about, the more people find support in their own individual process. And that's everything for me.
But I would love to see more people in psychology and more therapists having knowledge about this.
Yeah. You're reminding me that there's a new organization starting called Spiritual Awakening International. And Yvonne Cason and a couple other people have started it. And that's kind of their goal, is to make people aware all over of the ranges of spiritual experience, and to have more cross-referencing between people who have NDEs and Kundalini experiences and mystical experiences and psychic experiences, to just know who's out there and have connections. And they're doing a talk once a month right now, and you can join it for free. I was just asked to be on the advisory board for it, which possibly probably do. The woman that started it, Yvonne Cason, was a major person in the Kundalini Research Network years ago. And she's had a lot of NDE experiences, and this has come out of her vision. So it's a potential of a way for people to connect. Another way to connect is through an organization called ACIST, ACISTE.org. And that's an organization of experiencers. And they're trying to set up a network so there can be peer counseling for people that need to meet others who are in this process. So there is more and more emerging right now. And I encourage anybody that thinks they might be in this process or any of these conditions to check out all these organizations and see if you can find a home somewhere of compatible people to connect with. I think it's a good sign that this is happening.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
highly encourage support during the process,
Yeah.
whatever feels right to people.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kai. Thanks for, being passionate to keep this going. So,
Thanks a lot, Alan and Kai. Appreciate
Thank you,
it.
Bonnie.
Yes. Namaste.
Namaste.
I'll see you next week, right?
Okay.
Okay.